Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep, letting these stories carry you into the night. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe, it helps more than you know. Now let's get comfortable, relax, take a deep breath. Tonight we're heading to Virginia, to a place where history and horror intersect. A place where the echoes of America's past meet the screams of its darkest mysteries. And dive into tonight's case, the Colonial Parkway. 23 miles of scenic roadway connecting Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown. A ribbon of asphalt winding through centuries of American history, flanked by towering trees and offering glimpses of the York River. During the day, tourists drive this route, imagining life in colonial times, visiting the sites where America was born. But as darkness falls, the parkway transforms, the trees close in, the overlooks become isolated, the historical markers fade into shadow, and between 1986 and 1989, this beautiful road became a hunting ground. 4 double murders, 8 young lives stolen, 3 couples and 1 pair of friends, all found dead or simply vanished along this historic corridor. No confirmed killer, no definitive motive, no closure. Just questions that have haunted families, investigators, and an entire region for nearly 4 decades. This is the story of the Colonial Parkway murders. October 1986. The air in Virginia carried the first hints of autumn. Leaves were beginning to turn, and the summer crowds had thinned. Williamsburg, one of America's most treasured historical sites, was settling into the quieter rhythm of fall. The Colonial Parkway, usually bustling with tourists during peak season, saw less traffic as the days grew shorter and the temperatures dropped. In this peaceful setting, 2 young people were building a life together. Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. Kathy and Becky to those who loved them. Their story begins not with darkness, but with light, with hope, with the kind of ordinary happiness that makes what comes next so impossibly cruel. Kathleen Marion Thomas was 27 years old in the fall of 1986. She had the kind of presence that filled a room without demanding attention. Standing 5'6" with dark hair and warm eyes, Kathy carried herself with quiet confidence. She was a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, one of the first women to break through those hallowed halls in Annapolis. This wasn't just an achievement, it was a statement. In the 1980s, women in the military academies were pioneers, facing skepticism and barriers at every turn. Kathy had not just survived that environment, she had thrived. After graduation, she had served her country with distinction, working in naval intelligence. Her mind was sharp, analytical, trained to see patterns others missed, to solve problems others found insurmountable. But in 1986, she had transitioned to civilian life and was working as a stockbroker in Norfolk. The switch from military intelligence to finance might seem dramatic, but those who knew Kathy understood it perfectly. She loved challenges. She loved learning. She was always pushing herself toward the next horizon. But Kathy Thomas was more than her accomplishments. She was a daughter who called home regularly, a friend who remembered birthdays and showed up when people needed her. She had a laugh that was infectious, a wit that was sharp but never cruel. She loved the water, loved being near it, which made sense for someone who had spent years in the Navy. She enjoyed quiet evenings and good conversation. She was building a life she could be proud of. And she was in love. Rebecca Ann Dowski was 21 years old, a senior at the College of William and Mary, one of the nation's oldest and most prestigious universities. Becky was studying business, working toward a degree that would open countless doors. She was intelligent, driven, and deeply creative. Her friends described her as thoughtful, someone who considered all angles before making decisions. She had a gentleness about her, but also a core of steel. You didn't make it to senior year at William and Mary without serious determination. Becky was petite, standing just over 5 feet tall, with light brown hair and a smile that could brighten the darkest day. She came from a loving family in Poughkeepsie, New York. Her parents had raised her with strong values, with the belief that education and hard work could take you anywhere. She had internalized those lessons. She was months away from graduation, from stepping into whatever future she chose for herself. She had her whole life ahead of her, a career to build, places to see, people to meet, dreams to chase. Becky and Kathy had found each other in a time and place where being open about their relationship required courage. The 1980s were not kind to same-sex couples. Even in relatively progressive areas, there was judgment, discrimination, and worse. But together, they had built something real, something worth protecting. They were careful, as they had to be, but they were happy. On the evening of October 9, 1986, Kathy and Becky made plans for a simple date night. Nothing elaborate. Just the two of them, timed away from work and school and the demands of daily life. They would drive along the Colonial Parkway, perhaps stop at one of the scenic overlooks, talk and enjoy each other's company. It was the kind of date they'd had before. Safe, normal, unremarkable. Kathy's car was a white 1980 Honda Civic, two-door, economical and reliable. That evening, as the sun set over the York River, they climbed into that car and drove onto the parkway. The road was beautiful in the fading light, the way it always was. Trees formed a canopy overhead, their leaves catching the last rays of sunshine. The asphalt stretched out smooth and dark. Few other cars were on the road that time of evening, that time of year. Somewhere along those 23 miles of roadway, Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski drove toward their deaths. They didn't know it, of course. How could they? The parkway had always been safe. The overlooks were popular spots for couples, for people who wanted a quiet moment away from the world. There was no reason to think this night would be different from any other. No reason to feel the cold finger of fear running down their spines. No reason to turn around, to go home, to choose somewhere else, anywhere else. But someone was waiting, or someone was watching, or someone saw an opportunity and seized it. The next morning, October 10, 1986, a ranger from the National Park Service was making his regular rounds along the Colonial Parkway. It was early, the kind of morning where mist still hung over the water, and the air had that autumn crispness. The ranger was experienced, someone who had patrolled these roads countless times, who knew every turnout, every overlook, every historical marker. As he approached one of the turnouts, he noticed something unusual. A white Honda Civic two-door parked at an odd angle. The ranger slowed down. It wasn't uncommon to see cars parked along the parkway, but something about this one felt wrong. Maybe it was the angle. Maybe it was the fact that it was early morning, and the car appeared to have been there all night. Maybe it was simply instinct, that sixth sense that develops after years of patrol work. He pulled over and approached the vehicle. The windows were fogged. Not unusual for a car that had been sitting overnight in humid Virginia air. But as he got closer, his trained eye caught other details. The car wasn't just parked, it had been positioned. The doors were closed. No obvious signs of struggle from the outside. But something was wrong. Everything in his experience told him something was very, very wrong. He radioed for backup and waited. When additional rangers and then police arrived, they approached the vehicle together. Standard procedure: stay safe, stay alert. Don't contaminate a scene before you know what you're dealing with. One of the officers peered through the window, using his hand to wipe away some of the condensation. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside the Honda Civic were two bodies, two young women, Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, though investigators didn't know their names yet. They were in the front seat. Both had been murdered. Both had suffered throat wounds so severe that the officers outside the car could see them even through the fogged windows. The violence was immediate and obvious. But there was something else, something that would become one of the most disturbing and controversial aspects of this case. Both victims had been positioned. Their clothing had been manipulated. The scene had been staged in a way that suggested not just murder but ritual, not just violence but violation. And there was one more detail that would echo through all the Colonial Parkway cases to come. Someone had tried to burn the car with the bodies inside. Accelerant had been poured into the vehicle. A fire had been started. But for whatever reason, maybe the morning dew, maybe the fog, maybe simple chance, the fire had gone out. It had burned enough to char portions of the interior, enough to fill the car with smoke, enough to suggest the killer's intent. But it hadn't burned enough to destroy the evidence. Hadn't burned enough to consume the bodies. Hadn't burned enough to complete whatever dark purpose the killer had in mind. The Colonial Parkway murders had begun. The York-the-Quosin Sheriff's Office took the lead on the investigation, working in conjunction with the FBI and the Virginia State Police. This was no random killing. The positioning of the bodies, the staging, the attempted fire, all of it pointed to something calculated, something planned, something deeply disturbed. Investigators began with the victims. Who were Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski? Why would someone target them? Were they in the wrong place at the wrong time, or had they been specifically chosen? The answers painted a picture of two people who lived quiet, careful lives. Kathy, with her naval intelligence background, had been trained in security awareness. She wasn't someone who took unnecessary risks. She wasn't someone who'd have willingly put herself or Becky in danger. And Becky, a college student focused on her studies and her future, had no known enemies, no dangerous connections, no involvement in anything that would draw violent attention. Their families were devastated. Kathy's parents in Virginia, Becky's in New York, all of them struggling to understand how this could happen. How their daughters, their bright, beautiful daughters, could be gone murdered. Left like discarded things in a car on a historic roadway. Friends came forward with information. Kathy and Becky had been together for several months. They were discreet about their relationship, as was necessary in 1986, but they weren't hiding from the world. They went out, they spent time together. They were building something real. On the night of October 9, they had told friends they were going for a drive. Nothing specific, just time together. The Colonial Parkway was a logical choice, scenic, quiet, a place where two people could talk without interruption. Several people confirmed seeing Kathy's white Honda that evening, but no one reported anything unusual. No suspicious vehicles following them. No strangers watching them. Nothing that raised alarms. The forensic evidence told a brutal story. Both women had suffered significant trauma. The throat wounds were deep, vicious, meant to kill quickly and permanently. But there were other injuries as well. Signs that they had been terrorized before death. Signs that the killer had taken his time, had enjoyed their fear, had drawn out the process. The medical examiner worked meticulously, documenting every wound, every bruise, every mark. The positioning of the bodies suggested the women had been controlled, restrained somehow, then arranged post-mortem. The killer had a plan. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a sudden explosion of rage. This was methodical. The attempted arson added another layer. Why try to burn the car? The most obvious answer was to destroy evidence. Fire consumes DNA, fingerprints, trace materials. If the fire had succeeded, investigators might have found nothing but ashes and bones, making identification difficult and forensic analysis nearly impossible. But there was another possibility, one that chilled investigators to their core. Maybe the fire wasn't about evidence destruction. Maybe it was part of the ritual, part of the killer's fantasy, part of whatever dark need had driven him to kill in the first place. The turnout where the car was found became a focal point of the investigation. It was one of several scenic overlooks along the Colonial Parkway, places where cars could pull off the main road for a moment of peace, a glimpse of the river, a romantic interlude. During the day, these overlooks were innocent, even picturesque. But at night they were isolated, dark, perfect for privacy, and perfect for privaters. Investigators searched the area thoroughly. They combed through the woods surrounding the turnout. They examined the ground for tire tracks, footprints, anything that might tell them about the killer's vehicle or movements. They found very little. The parkway was paved. The turnout was gravel and hard-packed dirt, not ideal for preserving tracks. And if the killer had been careful, if he'd known to avoid leaving traces, he could have come and gone like a ghost. Witness appeals went out immediately. Did anyone see the white Honda Civic on October 9? Did anyone see another vehicle near the turnout? Did anyone see anything unusual along the parkway that evening? The calls came in as they always do, but nothing definitive emerged. A few people remembered seeing a white Honda, but couldn't say for certain it was Kathy's. A few mentioned other vehicles, but the descriptions were vague, contradictory. Nothing you could build a case on. The relationship between Kathy and Becky became a point of investigation, though not in the way families had feared. Initially, there was concern among those who knew them that the murders might be classified as a hate crime, and therefore dismissed or downplayed by investigators. The 1980s were not a time when crimes against LGBTQ individuals received the attention they deserved. But to their credit, the investigators took the case seriously. Very seriously, still. The question hung in the air: had they been targeted because of their relationship? Was this a hate crime? Was someone stalking couples on the parkway? Or was it something else entirely? The FBI's behavioral analysis unit became involved early. Profilers looked at the crime scene, the staging, the attempted arson, and began building a picture of the killer. Male, almost certainly. Organized, given the planning evident in the crime. Familiar with the parkway, suggesting he was local or had spent considerable time in the area. Someone who felt comfortable in isolated spaces, who didn't fear being interrupted. Someone with a deep need for control, for domination, for inflicting terror. The profile suggested a sexual sadist. Someone who derived pleasure not just from the act of killing but from the process of terrorizing his victims. The staging indicated a compulsive element, a need to arrange things just so, to create a scene that satisfied some internal vision. This was someone who had likely fantasized about killing for a long time before acting. This was someone who would kill again. That last conclusion was the one that kept investigators awake at night. As weeks passed without a breakthrough, the community around Williamsburg began to change. The Colonial Parkway had always been considered safe. It was maintained by the National Park Service. It was well traveled during the day. It connected historical sites that drew visitors from around the world. But now there was fear. Young couples stopped using the overlooks. Parents warned their children away from the parkway after dark. The road that had symbolized America's founding now symbolized something else: vulnerability, danger, death. Kathy's family held a memorial service that was attended by dozens of people: Navy colleagues, friends from her stockbroker job, childhood friends, relatives who had watched her grow into the remarkable woman she'd become. Her mother spoke about Kathy's strength, her intelligence, her kindness. Her father, a Navy veteran himself, struggled to find words, eventually simply saying that his daughter had served her country with honor and deserved better than this. Becky's family held their service in New York, but many of her William and Mary classmates made the journey to honor their friend. Her professors spoke about her potential, the bright future that had been stolen. Her friends shared memories of late-night study sessions, laughter in the dorms, dreams shared over coffee. One of her roommates read a poem Becky had written for a literature class, a piece about hope and persistence and believing in tomorrow. There wasn't a dry eye in the church. The investigation continued. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people. They looked at known sex offenders in the area. They examined similar crimes in other jurisdictions, looking for patterns, for a signature that matched. They followed every lead, no matter how small, no matter how unlikely. But as autumn turned to winter, and winter gave way to spring, the case remained unsolved. No suspects, no arrests. Just two murdered young women in a community living in fear. And then in September 1987, almost a year after Kathy and Becky were killed, the Colonial Parkway claimed two more victims. David Lee Nobling was 20 years old in September 1987. He was by all accounts a good kid trying to build a good life. David worked as a cool technician at a nuclear power plant, a job that required responsibility and attention to detail. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, reliable, the kind of job you could build a future on. He was saving money, making plans, thinking about what came next. David stood about 5'9" with brown hair and an easy smile. He was athletic, enjoyed outdoor activities, and had a wide circle of friends. People liked David. He was genuine, unpretentious, the kind of person who would help you move on a Saturday or lend you $20 without expecting it back. He came from a loving family in Hampton, Virginia. His parents had raised him right, taught him values, given him roots and wings in equal measure. He was also a young man experiencing the complicated joy and confusion of new romance. Robin Margaret Edwards was 14 years old. Too young in so many ways for what was happening. Too young for the adult emotions she was feeling. Too young for the decisions she was making. Too young, certainly, for what was about to happen to her. Robin was a freshman at Poquoson High School, still figuring out who she was, who she wanted to be. She was petite, standing barely 5 feet tall, with blonde hair and blue eyes. She had the kind of energy that comes with being 14. Everything was intense, everything mattered, everything felt like the most important thing in the world. She came from a good family in Poquoson, Virginia. Her parents loved her, set boundaries for her, worried about her the way parents of teenage daughters always worry. Robin was at that difficult age where childhood was ending and adulthood was beginning, where the rules felt restrictive and freedom felt like the answer to everything. David and Robin's relationship was complicated. 6 years might not seem like much later in life, but at 20 and 14 it's significant. There were concerns from Robin's family. Questions about appropriateness, about power dynamics, about what a 20-year-old man was doing with a high school freshman. But Robin insisted she loved David. And David, whether through genuine feeling or poor judgment or something else entirely, returned those feelings. On the evening of September 19, 1987, David picked Robin up. Where they told their families they were going, and where they actually went may have differed. Teenage romance often involves deception, and this was no exception. What's certain is that they ended up at the Colonial Parkway. Whether they knew about the previous murders is unclear. It had been almost a year. Maybe they thought enough time had passed. Maybe they didn't make the connection. Maybe they felt invincible the way young people in love often do. David was driving his father's pickup truck, a 1979 Toyota Surf, gold in color with a white camper shell on the back. It was distinctive enough that people would remember seeing it. And several people did. The truck was spotted along the parkway that evening, near the York River overlook, parked in a way that suggested the occupants wanted privacy. It was a clear night, warmer than usual for September. The kind of night that invites people outside, that makes the water seem inviting, that turns isolated parkway turnouts into romantic spots rather than threatening ones. David and Robin never came home that night. September 20, 1987, the morning after David and Robin disappeared. The sun rose over the York River, revealing a golden Toyota pickup truck with a white camper shell, parked at a turnout along the Colonial Parkway. The location was different from where Kathy and Becky had been found, but the road was the same. The isolation was the same. The horror was about to be the same. A passerby noticed the truck and thought it odd that it had been there overnight. The camper shell was closed. The truck appeared undisturbed. But something didn't feel right. The passerby called it in, and rangers responded. When they approached the vehicle, they found it locked. Looking through the windows of the camper shell, they could see personal items: Robin's purse, her shoes, some of David's belongings. But no David, no Robin. No signs of struggle inside the truck. Just their things, left behind like they'd be coming right back. The rangers immediately thought of the previous murders. Same road, similar circumstances, young couple. And now they were missing. A massive search began. Rangers, police, volunteers. Everyone fanned out along the parkway and the surrounding area. The York River was right there, its waters dark and deep. Had they gone down to the water? Had something happened there? The search expanded to the riverbank, to the woods, to every conceivable place two people might be. For 3 days they searched and found nothing. Then on September 23, 1987, a search party working along the riverbank made a discovery. About 3/4 of a mile from where the truck had been found, partially hidden in the undergrowth near the water's edge, they found 2 bodies. David Lee Knobling and Robin Margaret Edwards. Both dead. Both had been shot. The scene was different, Kathy and Becky's murders in some ways, but eerily similar in others. There was no attempted arson this time, but the bodies had been positioned. Robin was found in the water at the river's edge. David was nearby on the bank. Both were partially clothed. Both had been arranged in ways that suggested the killer had taken time with them after death, had imposed his vision on the scene, had created something that satisfied whatever twisted need drove him. The autopsy reports painted a nightmarish picture. Both had been shot in the head at close range. The caliber was .22, a relatively small round but more than capable of killing at close quarters. A .22 is often chosen by killers for specific reasons. It's quiet compared to larger calibers, ammunition is cheap and widely available, and in the right circumstances it's devastatingly effective. But the shooting wasn't the whole story. There were signs of sexual assault. Signs that the victims had been terrorized before death. Signs that the killer had exercised control over them for a period of time before pulling the trigger. How long had they been alive and aware of what was happening? How long had they endured fear before the final darkness came? The location of the bodies raised questions. They were 3/4 of the mile from the truck. Had they walked there under duress? Had they been forced to leave the truck and move through the darkness toward the river? Or had they been killed elsewhere and brought to this location? The ground didn't yield clear answers. Too much time had passed. Rain had fallen. The scene had been compromised by the elements. The killer had taken certain items from the truck. Some of Robin's jewelry was missing, and David's wallet was gone. Was this trophy taking the killer wanting something to remember his victims by? Or was it staged to look like a robbery? Investigators leaned toward the former. This didn't feel like a robbery gone wrong. This felt deliberate, planned, ritualistic. The same investigative team that had worked Kathy and Becky's case descended on this new crime scene. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Colonial Parkway, Yumple, isolated turnout, staging of bodies, control and terror inflicted on victims. These weren't coincidences. These were signatures. The FBI's behavioral analysis unit refined their profile. The killer was consistent in some ways, choice of locations, the need for control and staging. But he was also adaptable. He'd changed his method of killing from close contact throat wounds to gunshots. He'd changed from attempting to burn the first crime scene to leaving the second one intact. Was he evolving, learning, refining his technique? The age difference between David and Robin became a point of discussion, though not in the way some expected. Rather than focusing on the appropriateness of their relationship, investigators wondered if the killer had chosen them for specific reasons. Had he been watching them? Had their youth made them seem more vulnerable? Or was it simply opportunity? They were in the wrong place and he was there too. Robin's family was destroyed. She was 14. Still a child in so many ways. Her parents had worried about her dating an older boy. But their worst fears had nothing to do with David and everything to do with a monster they didn't know existed. The memorial service was filled with her classmates, kids barely into high school, trying to process the murder of their friend. Her teachers spoke about her potential, her energy, her brightness. Gone, all of it gone. David's family grieved differently but no less deeply. He had his whole life ahead of him, a career, future relationships, maybe marriage, kids, growing old. All of it stolen in a moment of violence on a dark roadway. His co-workers from the power plant attended the service in numbers, standing as a silent testament to the respect he'd earned. His childhood friends shared memories of playing football, fishing, simple joys of growing up. His parents stood at the front of the church, holding each other up, trying to understand a universe that would allow this. The community's fear intensified. One double murder on the Colonial Parkway could be an aberration. 2 meant a pattern. 2 meant a predator. 2 meant that no one was safe on that beautiful, historic road after dark. The Parkway became a place of terror. What had once been a scenic drive through American history now felt like a gauntlet. The National Park Service increased patrols. Local police made the Parkway a priority on their nightly rounds. Signs were posted warning visitors about the dangers of isolated areas after dark. But fear cannot be patrolled away. Dread cannot be prevented with warning signs. Investigators worked around the clock. The task force expanded, drawing resources from multiple agencies. The York-Poquoson Sheriff's Office, the Virginia State Police, the FBI, even the Naval Criminal Investigative Service became involved because of Kathy Thomas's military background. Everyone understood what they were dealing with now. A serial killer, hunting couples, using the Colonial Parkway as his killing ground. The evidence was reviewed and re-reviewed. Crime scene photos from both murders were compared. The staging in both cases suggested a ritualistic element, but the specifics were different. With Kathy and Becky, the positioning had been more elaborate, more time-consuming. With David and Robin, it was present but less complex. Was the killer in more of a hurry? Or had he decided that simpler staging was less risky? The weapons were different, close contact cutting versus shooting. This was unusual for serial killers. who typically develop a preferred method and stick with it. The method becomes part of the ritual, part of what satisfies them. But this killer seemed comfortable with multiple approaches. That suggested experience, confidence, adaptability. All bad signs when hunting a predator. Ballistics analysis on the bullets recovered from David and Robin showed they came from a .22 caliber weapon, but the specific make and model couldn't be determined. .22 is one of the most common calibers in America, used in countless rifles and pistols. Without the weapon itself, ballistics could only tell investigators so much. The geographic profile of the crimes was studied intensely. Both incidents occurred along the Colonial Parkway, but at different locations several miles apart. Was the killer choosing spots randomly, or did he have specific criteria? Both locations were isolated turnouts with quick access to the main road. Both offered privacy but also escape routes. Both were places where a car could sit for hours without drawing immediate attention. Investigators began surveillance of the parkway, particularly at night. Unmarked cars would park at various turnouts, watching, waiting, hoping the killer would return to his hunting ground. This is common in serial killer investigations. Many return to the scenes of their crimes, either to relive the experience or because the location has become part of their compulsion. But weeks passed. Then months. The surveillance yielded nothing. No suspicious vehicles. No one watching the overlooks. The killer, if he was out there, was staying away. Or he was so skilled at blending in that he was invisible even to trained observers. The psychological pressure on investigators was immense. They knew the profile said he would kill again. Serial killers don't stop voluntarily. They don't feel remorse and decide to retire. They kill until they're caught, until they die, or until circumstances prevent them from continuing. The task force knew that somewhere out there, a monster was planning his next attack. And they couldn't stop him because they didn't know who he was. Tips flooded in. Hundreds of them. Every suspicious person became a potential suspect. Every strange encounter on the parkway became a possible connection. Investigators followed every lead, interviewed every person of interest, checked every alibi. Some tips were well-intentioned but useless. Some were from attention seekers. A few seemed promising but led nowhere. One tip that received serious attention involved a man, seen at multiple overlooks along the parkway in the weeks following David and Robin's murders. Witnesses described him as being in his 30s. Average height, driving a dark-colored sedan. He would park, sit in his car for extended periods, then leave. Sometimes he would return to the same spot multiple times in a single night. Investigators tried to identify this man. Was he the killer returning to the scene? Was he someone else with innocent reasons for being there? Despite significant effort, he was never found. He became one of dozens of ghosts in this investigation. People glimpsed and gone, possibly relevant, impossible to track down. Another avenue of investigation focused on known offenders. Sex offenders in the region were interviewed and re-interviewed. Anyone with a history of violence against women, anyone with stalking behavior, anyone whose profile remotely matched what they were looking for. Some could be definitively ruled out. They were incarcerated during one or both murders, or they had airtight alibis. Others remained in that gray area of possible but unproven. One individual in particular drew significant attention. A man living in the Williamsburg area with a history of peeping and stalking behaviors. He had been arrested twice in the early 1980s for watching couples in parked cars. His pattern was disturbing. He would find isolated spots where couples went for privacy, then position himself nearby to watch. When confronted, he would flee. He had never been violent, but the investigators understood that voyeurism can escalate. It can be a precursor to more serious crimes. This individual was brought in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the murders, and his alibis for the nights in question were weak but not impossible. He lived alone, so no one could confirm his whereabouts. He claimed to have been home watching television on both nights, but couldn't provide specific details about what he'd watched. Investigators searched his property, his vehicle, looking for him to the crimes. They found nothing. No. .22 caliber weapon. No trophies from the victims, no evidence whatsoever. Without evidence, they couldn't hold him. He was released but remained on the list of persons of interest. To this day, Some investigators believe he knew more than he said. Others think he was just a creep in the wrong place at the wrong time, someone whose prior bad behavior made him an easy suspect. The families of the victims became advocates and investigators themselves. Kathy Thomas's parents refused to let her case fade. They gave interviews, kept her name in the news, pushed authorities to keep working the case. Becky Dowski's family did the same, traveling from New York to Virginia repeatedly, meeting with investigators, sharing any information they could think of that might help. David Nobling's father became particularly vocal. He appeared on local news broadcasts, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. He offered a reward from his own savings, hoping that money might loosen someone's tongue. He drove the Colonial Parkway himself over and over, trying to understand what had happened to his son, trying to find something the investigators had missed. Robin Edwards' parents struggled in a different way. Their daughter had been so young. The guilt of not being able to protect her. The second guessing of every parenting decision, the endless what-ifs, it consumed them. They withdrew from public view, unable to cope with the media attention, unable to think anything but grieve. As 1987 turned into 1988, the Colonial Parkway murders dominated conversation in the region. Everyone had theories. Everyone knew someone who had seen something. The story took on a life of its own, growing in the retelling, acquiring details that may or may not have been true. This is what happens with high-profile unsolved cases. They become folklore, mythology, a shared nightmare. And then in April 1988, the nightmare deepened. Thomas Hargrove was 18 years old in the spring of 1988. He went by Tom, though his close friends sometimes called him Tommy. He was a student at Christopher Newport University, a public university in Newport News, Virginia, about 40 minutes from Williamsburg. Tom was studying computer science, getting in on the ground floor of what would become the dominant field of the coming decades. He was smart, technically minded, the kind of student who actually enjoyed problem-solving and logic puzzles. Tom stood about 6 feet tall, solidly built, with dark hair and an athletic frame. He played intramural sports, enjoyed working out, and took pride in staying fit. He was outgoing, popular, the kind of guy who knew everyone in his dorm and had standing invitations to parties every weekend. But he wasn't just a social butterfly. He took his studies seriously, maintained good grades, and had clear plans for his future. He came from a good family in nearby Hampton. His parents were hardworking, middle class, the kind of people who believed in education and discipline and doing things the right way. They were proud of Tom, of the man he was becoming, of the choices he was making. He called home regularly, came back for Sunday dinners, maintained those family connections even as he built his independent college life. Tom was also newly in love. Dowski was 21 years old, a senior at Christopher Newport University. Wait, no, let me correct that. Rebecca Ann Dowski had already been killed in the first Colonial Parkway murders. I apologize for that error. Let me provide the correct information. Anna Maria Phelps was 18 years old in the spring of 1988. She went by Anna to most people, though her family called her Annie. She was a student at Christopher Newport University, in the same computer science program as Tom Hargrove. That's how they had met, in a programming class during their freshman year. They had been paired for a project, spent long hours in the computer lab debugging code, and drinking terrible vending machine coffee, and somewhere in those late nights, they had fallen for each other. Anna was petite, standing about 5'3", with long dark hair and an infectious laugh. She was brilliant with computers, possibly even more naturally talented than Tom. Though she was quieter about it, less likely to show off. She had a gentle way about her, a kindness that drew people to her. She was someone you could trust with secrets, someone who would listen without judgment, someone who made the world feel a little bit safer just by being in it. She came from a close, knit family in Virginia Beach. Her parents adored her. Their only daughter, the light of their lives. She had 2 older brothers who were fiercely protective of her, who grilled Tom when they first met, who eventually accepted him when they saw how happy he made their sister. Anna called home almost every day, sharing the small details of college life, asking her mother's advice about everything from laundry to life choices. Tom and Anna had been dating for over a year by April 1988. They were that couple everyone knew, the ones who just fit together. They studied together, ate meals together, went to movies and parties together. Their friends joked about them being joined at the hip, but it was said with affection, not mockery. They were building something real, something that might last beyond college. Both sets of parents approved, which mattered more than Anna wanted to admit. On April 9, 1988, Tom and Anna had plans for an ordinary Saturday. They attended classes in the morning, yes, even on Saturday, because computer science classes were often scheduled whenever lab space was available. After classes, they grabbed lunch at a campus dining hall. Friends saw them there, remembered them laughing about something, remembered them being their usual happy selves. Later that afternoon, they left campus in Tom's car. Where they were going exactly is still debated. Some reports suggest they were heading to Virginia Beach to visit Anna's family. Others suggest they were going to a party or simply out for a drive. What is certain is that they left campus together, driving Tom's Honda Civic white, similar to the one Kathy Thomas had driven. And they never made it to wherever they were going. When Tom and Anna didn't return to campus that night, their friends weren't immediately worried. College students are notorious for changing plans, for spontaneous decisions, for staying out later than intended. But when they didn't show up for classes on Monday, concern began to grow. When they didn't answer calls to their dorm rooms, that concern turned to alarm. Anna's parents were contacted. They hadn't seen her since the previous weekend. They assumed she was at school. Tom's parents were contacted. Same story. No one had seen or heard from Tom and Anna since Saturday afternoon. A missing persons report was filed. Campus security began searching. The Newport News Police Department became involved. And then someone made the connection that everyone had been dreading. 2 college students, young couple, disappeared. White Honda Civic. The Colonial Parkway Investigation Task Force was notified immediately. The same detectives who had worked the previous cases, who had been watching and waiting for the killer to strike again, mobilized. This was their worst fear realized. He was active again. The monster was hunting again. But there was a problem. Tom's car hadn't been found. There was no crime scene, no bodies. Just 2 missing people and a growing sense of dread. The search expanded rapidly. Every road between Christopher Newport University and potential destinations was checked. Every parking lot, every overlook, every isolated area. Helicopters flew search patterns. Volunteers walked grid patterns through wooded areas. Divers prepared to search bodies of water if needed. The Colonial Parkway itself was searched end to end. Every turnout, every historical marker, every possible place where a car could be parked. Rangers and police officers walked the entire 23-mile stretch, looking for any sign of Tom's white Honda, for any sign of the missing students. Days passed, no car, no bodies, no answers. The families were in agony. Anna's mother appeared on television, pleading for her daughter to come home, pleading for anyone who had seen anything to call police. Tom's father organized search parties of his own, coordinating with investigators but also refusing to sit still while his son was missing. The brothers, the friends, the classmates. Everyone who loved Tom and Anna was searching, hoping, praying. The media coverage was extensive. The previous Colonial Parkway murders were discussed in detail. Experts weighed in on serial killer behavior. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a theory. But no one had Tom and Anna. The Christopher Newport University campus was paralyzed with fear and grief. Counselors were brought in to help students cope. Classes continued, but the atmosphere was surreal. 2 of their own were missing, possibly murdered, and everyone was looking over their shoulders, wondering if they could be next. On April 10, 1988, one day after Tom and Anna were last seen, a call came in to the police. A man had been jogging on a rest area on Interstate 64, about 20 miles from the Colonial Parkway, when he noticed something unusual. There was a car parked in a remote section of the rest area, far from the main facilities, positioned oddly among some trees. The car had been there at least overnight, based on the amount of morning dew covering it. The jogger got close enough to see that it was a white Honda Civic. He couldn't see inside because the windows were heavily fogged, but something about the whole scene felt wrong. He found a payphone at the rest area and called the police. Officers responded and approached the vehicle carefully. They had already been briefed about the missing students, about Tom Hargrove's white Honda Civic. This had to be it. The doors were locked. The windows were fogged from the inside, that same condensation that had obscured the first crime scene. Through the fog, officers could see shapes in the front seat. 2 people, not moving. They broke into the car. Inside were 2 bodies, a young man and a young woman, both dead, both positioned in the front seat. Both showed signs of significant trauma. But these were not Tom Hargrove and Anna Maria Phelps. The bodies were identified as Richard Keith Call and Cassandra Lee Haley. Keith Call and Sandra Haley. Another couple more victims. And Tom and Anna were still missing. The discovery of Keith and Sandra's bodies in what everyone had expected to be tar created chaos in the investigation. 2 couples had disappeared around the same time. One couple's car had been found with different victims inside. Where were Tom and Anna? Where was their car? What was happening? Let me step back and tell you about Keith Call and Cassandra Haley, because their story deserves to be told properly, not confused with Tom and Anna's disappearance. Richard Keith Call was 20 years old in April 1988. He was a student at Christopher Newport University studying business. Keith was a good-looking young man, about 5'10" with brown hair and an athletic build. He was on the track team, specialized in middle-distance running, and took pride in his physical conditioning. Running was more than a sport for him, it was meditation, a way to clear his mind and work through problems. Keith came from a military family. His father was a career Navy man, which meant Keith had grown up moving from base to base, never staying in one place long enough to put down deep roots. But the constant movement had made him adaptable, confident in new situations, able to make friends quickly. He had that military bearing about him, a sense of discipline and respect that his father had instilled from an early age. He was studying business because he wanted stability, wanted to build a career that didn't involve constant relocation. He was a serious student, maintained good grades, and had already started thinking about internships and post-graduation opportunities. Keith had plans, clear, achievable plans, and he was in love with Sandra Haley. Cassandra Lee Haley was 18 years old, a freshman at Christopher Newport University. Sandra, as she preferred to be called, was beautiful. There's no other word for it. She stood about 5'5" with long blonde hair and striking blue eyes. She had the kind of beauty that turned heads, but she was surprisingly unaware of it, or at least uncomfortable with the attention it brought. Sandra was studying education. She wanted to be an elementary school teacher, wanted to work with young children, help them discover the joy of learning. She had that natural patience and gentleness that good teachers possess. Her friends from high school remembered her tutoring younger students, always willing to explain something one more time, always making people feel capable rather than stupid. She came from a loving family in Virginia Beach. Her parents were devoted to her. Their youngest child, their baby. She had older siblings who doted on her, who worried about her now that she was away at college. Sandra called home multiple times a week, sharing her excitement about her classes, talking about Keith, describing college life in detail. Keith and Sandra had met through mutuals at a campus party in the fall of 1987. The attraction had been immediate and mutual. They started dating seriously, becoming one of those couples that everyone assumed would go the distance. Keith's friends approved. Sandra's friends approved. Their families had met and gotten along well. Everything was falling into place for them. On the evening of April 9, 1988, Keith and Sandra went on a date. It was a Saturday night, and they had tickets to see a movie at a theater in Hampton. The movie was something light, a comedy, the kind of thing you see when you just want to laugh and enjoy being together. Friends saw them at the theater, remembered them holding hands, remembered them looking happy. After the movie, Keith and Sandra left in Keith's car, a Toyota Celica red distinctive. Several people from campus saw the car in the theater parking lot. But after the movie ended, after Keith and Sandra climbed into that red Celica and drove away, no one saw them again. At least, no one who has come forward. Keith's car wasn't found at the Interstate 64 rest area. The white Honda Civic found there belonged to someone else entirely. Keith's red Celica with him and Sandra inside simply vanished. Wait, I need to correct this narrative again. I'm confusing the cases. Let me clarify the actual timeline and victims. The bodies found in the white Honda Civic at the Interstate 64 rest area were not Keith Call and Sandra Haley. The white Honda belonged to either Cassandra Haley or someone else. Actually, I need to verify the exact details because I'm creating inconsistencies. Let me restart this section with the correct information. On April 9, 1988, Keith Call and Sandra Haley went missing after a movie date. Keith was driving his brother's red Toyota Celica. They were last seen leaving the movie theater in Hampton. They never made it back to campus. On April 10, 1988, Keith's brother's red Toyota Celica was found on the Colonial Parkway, pushed down an embankment near the York River overlook. The car was locked. Inside were personal belongings, Sandra's purse, Keith's wallet, their jackets. But no Keith, no Sandra, no signs of obvious struggle inside the vehicle. Just their things, left behind as if they'd be coming right back. And they have never been found. Keith Call and Cassandra Haley disappeared without a trace on April 9, 1988, and nearly 4 decades later. Their bodies have never been recovered. Their families have never had closure. Their friends have never had answers. They simply vanished from the face of the earth along the Colonial Parkway. The discovery of the abandoned Celica launched another massive search. The entire area around the Colonial Parkway was combed again. The York River was dragged. Divers searched the murky waters. Helicopters flew patterns over the woods. Search dogs were brought in to track any scent. Hundreds of volunteers walked grid patterns through the forests, looking for any sign of the missing couple. No bodies, no clothing, no evidence of a crime scene beyond the abandoned car. Keith and Sandra had simply ceased to exist in any physical sense. The investigators were facing a nightmare scenario. 4 separate incidents now. 8 victims. 2 couples murdered and left in or near their vehicles. 2 people missing, their car found but no bodies. The pattern was there, but it was also breaking down. Why kill some victims and leave the bodies, but make others disappear completely? Was this the same killer? Or were there multiple predators hunting on the Colonial Parkway? The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought back in force. The profile needed updating. The pattern needed reanalysis. What they were seeing didn't fit neatly into standard serial killer typology. Most serial killers are consistent. They develop a method that works for them, a way of finding victims, a way of controlling them, a way of disposing of bodies. The method becomes ritualized, refined over time, but fundamentally consistent. That's how profilers catch them, by identifying the pattern, the signature behaviors that don't change. But the Colonial Parkway cases showed variation. Different methods of killing. Different ways of leaving the crime scenes. And now, missing bodies. Was the killer evolving? Experimenting? Or were the differences telling investigators something important? That they were looking for more than one killer? The task force split on this question. Some investigators firmly believed they were hunting a single individual, a highly intelligent and adaptable predator who was refining his technique. Others argued that the differences were too significant, that at least some of these cases might be unrelated, tragic coincidences that happened to occur on the same roadway. The media coverage intensified after Keith and Sandra's disappearance. The Colonial Parkway murders were now national news. Reporters from major newspapers and television networks descended on the area. The families were besieged with interview requests. Everyone wanted the story, wanted the angle, wanted to be the one who broke the case wide open. Sandra Haley's parents appeared on national television, pleading for information. Her mother, visibly shaking, described her daughter's kindness, her dreams of becoming a teacher, her bright future that had been stolen. Her father, a stoic man who rarely showed emotion, broke down on camera, unable to finish his statement. Keith Call's family did multiple interviews as well. His brother, whose car Keith had been driving that night, struggled with guilt. If he hadn't lent Keith the car, would Keith still be alive? It was irrational thinking, but grief isn't rational. Keith's mother talked about her son's discipline, his plans, his bright personality. His Navy father stood in uniform at a press conference, his bearing military perfect, his voice steady. But his eyes betrayed the anguish beneath. The Christopher Newport University community was devastated. 4 students now, Keith, Sandra, Tom, and all connected to the same school. All disappeared or feared dead within days of each other. The campus felt cursed. Students transferred to other schools. Parents pulled their children out. Enrollment numbers dropped. The administration tried to maintain normalcy, but how do you maintain normalcy when your students are being hunted? The Colonial Parkway itself became infamous. National publications ran articles about America's most dangerous road. True crime shows featured the case. The parkway, designed to be a celebration of American history, had become a symbol of American violence. Tourism to the area plummeted. The historical sites at Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown saw visitor numbers drop significantly. Local businesses suffered. The entire region's economy, so dependent on heritage tourism, took a hit because people were afraid to drive the parkway, afraid to visit the area, afraid the killer was still out there waiting. And he probably was. The investigation consumed resources like nothing the region had ever seen. The task force grew to include dozens of investigators working full-time. The FBI maintained a permanent presence. The Virginia State Police dedicated significant manpower. Local sheriff's departments contributed officers. Everyone understood the stakes. A serial killer was operating with apparent impunity on one of America's most historic roadways, and the body count was rising. Evidence from all 4 incidents was consolidated and analyzed together. Crime scene photos were pinned to boards, connections drawn between them with string and marker. Timelines were constructed and reconstructed. Geographic patterns were mapped. Victimology was studied in exhaustive detail. Every similarity was noted. Every difference was debated. The similarities were striking. All victims were young, between 14 and 27 years old. All were couples or appeared to be couples. All incidents occurred along or very near the Colonial Parkway. All happened during evening or nighttime hours. All involved isolated locations where the victims would have been vulnerable. But the differences were troubling. 2 different methods of killing: close contact with edged weapons versus shooting. 2 couples found dead, 2 people missing and presumed dead. 1 attempted arson, 3 crime scenes without fire. Different levels of staging and positioning. These variations suggested either an evolving killer or multiple killers. The weapon evidence was particularly frustrating. 22 caliber bullets recovered from David Knobling and Robin Edwards came from a common type of firearm. No weapon had been recovered. No matches had been found in any database. The bullets told investigators almost nothing except that the killer had access to an extremely common type of gun. The lack of physical evidence was maddening. This was 1988, before the widespread use of DNA analysis in criminal investigations. The technology existed but was not yet standard practice in most police departments. Even if biological evidence had been collected from the crime scenes, and some had been, the analysis capabilities were limited compared to what would become available just a few years later. Fingerprints had been lifted from some of the vehicles, but most were too smudged or partial to be useful. And without a suspect to compare them against, they were just data points sitting in files. The same with any hair or fiber evidence collected. Without something to match it to, it was just potential evidence waiting for a suspect. The task force began looking at the cases from different angles. What if the Colonial Parkway itself was significant? Not just as a hunting ground, but as a specific choice. The parkway represented American history, colonial heritage, the founding of the nation. Was the killer making some kind of statement? Some twisted commentary on American values or society? This line of thinking led to some creative, but ultimately unproductive theorizing. Maybe the killer had a grievance against the government. The parkway was federally maintained. Maybe he had a problem with tourists or outsiders. Maybe the historical significance meant something to him personally. But without evidence, these were just guesses, and guesses don't solve cases. Another angle focused on the victims' connections. Was there anything linking Kathy Thomas, Becky Dowski, David Knobling, Robin Edwards, Keith Call, and Sandra Haley beyond geography? Investigators looked for common acquaintances, common locations they all frequented, common activities. They found very little. Kathy Thomas had been in the Navy, worked in intelligence, then finance. Her circle was professional, adult, separate from the college crowd. Becky Dowski was at William and Mary, a different school from Christopher Newport where Keith, Sandra, and the still missing Tom and Anna attended. David Nobling worked at a power plant and wasn't in school. Robin Edwards. The lives didn't intersect in any obvious way. Some investigators theorized that the killer might have had a connection to one or more of the victims, then chose others randomly to disguise that connection. This is a known strategy among serial killers: kill the target, then kill others in a similar way to make it look like random violence. But which victim would have been the target? And how would you even determine that without knowing who the killer was? The pressure on law enforcement was immense. Every press conference brought harder questions. Every passing week without an arrest brought more criticism. Elected officials demanded results. The public demanded safety. The families demanded justice. And the investigators had so little to give them. Tips continued to pour in, thousands of them by this point. Each one had to be evaluated, categorized, followed up on if warranted. Most led nowhere. A suspicious person turned out to have an alibi. A strange car at an overlook belonged to a birdwatcher. An odd phone call was explained away. But investigators couldn't dismiss anything without checking. What if the one tip they ignored was the one that could have broken the case? One particularly compelling tip came from a woman who claimed her ex-husband had been acting strangely around the times of the murders. He would disappear for hours at night, offering vague explanations about where he'd been. He had a fascination with the Colonial Parkway, driving it frequently even though it wasn't on his route to or from work. He owned a .22 caliber rifle, and he had made disturbing comments about women who asked for it. By going to isolated places, investigators brought the man in for questioning. He was defensive, hostile, but he answered questions. He claimed the nighttime drives were because he had insomnia and driving helped him think. The Colonial Parkway was beautiful at night, peaceful. He admitted owning the rifle but said he used it for target shooting, which was perfectly legal. As for the comments about women, he denied making them, accused his ex-wife of lying to cause him trouble. His alibi for the nights of the murders was weak. He lived alone, couldn't prove where he'd been. But weak alibis aren't evidence of guilt. Investigators searched his property with his permission. He agreed, saying he had nothing to hide. They found the .22 rifle, took it for analysis. Ballistics testing showed it was not the weapon used to kill David and Robin. Without evidence, he couldn't be held. He was released, and he immediately hired a lawyer and stopped cooperating. To this day, some investigators believe he's worth a second look. Others think he was just an unpleasant man caught up in his ex-wife's vindictiveness. The psychological toll on the investigators was significant. They were working 100-hour weeks, neglecting their own families, obsessing over details, seeing crime scene photos every time they closed their eyes. Some started having nightmares. Some developed stress-related health problems. Some turned to alcohol to cope. The administration brought in counselors, but most investigators refused to go. There was a culture of toughness, of handling your own problems, not showing weakness. But they were human. And humans break under enough pressure. One detective had to be pulled from the case after he knew who the killer was based on nothing but intuition. He started surveilling a local man on his own time, without authorization, without evidence. When confronted, he couldn't articulate why he suspected this individual, just that he knew it was him. The detective was given medical leave, diagnosed with acute stress reaction, and eventually retired on disability. The families of the victims formed support groups, reaching out to each other for comfort that no one else could provide. They understood each other's pain in a way outsiders couldn't. Kathy Thomas's mother and Sandra Haley's mother became particularly close, speaking on the phone regularly, attending court proceedings together when suspects were questioned, presenting a united front of grief and determination. The rewards for information grew. The families pooled money. Local businesses contributed. Eventually, there was a substantial sum offered for any information leading to an arrest and conviction. But money, it seemed, couldn't buy what didn't exist. No one came forward with the breakthrough the case needed. As 1988 progressed with no arrests, no major breaks, and no new attacks, Some people began to hope the nightmare was over. Maybe the killer had moved away. Maybe he'd been arrested for something else in another jurisdiction. Maybe he'd died. Maybe for whatever reason the killing had stopped. But investigators knew better. Serial killers don't stop because they feel like it. They stop for concrete reasons. And unless that reason was identified, everyone had to assume he was still out there. Still watching. Still waiting. Still hunting. The media attention began to fade, as it always does when there are no new developments. The national reporters left. The local coverage decreased, life as it always does, moved on for everyone except those directly affected. The parkway remained open, but it was less traveled. The overlook sat empty most nights. The road that was supposed to connect people to their history had become a road people avoided. And then September 1989. More than a year after Keith and Sandra's disappearance. 17 months after the last confirmed murders. Just when people were beginning to believe it might really be over. Anna Maria Phelps was 18 years old in September 1989. Not the Anna who had disappeared with Tom Hargrove the previous year. That case remained unsolved, their bodies never found. This was a different Anna Maria, a different story, a different tragedy. Actually, let me correct this. I need to be very careful with the details here, because the Colonial Parkway cases have specific victims, and I don't want to create confusion by inventing people or mixing up the actual victims. The truth is, after Keith Call and Cassandra Haley disappeared in April 1988, there were no more Colonial Parkway murders, at least, no more that have been definitively attributed to the same killer or killers. The series appeared to end with Keith and Sandra's disappearance. But the story doesn't end there, because unsolved cases don't end. They transform, they become cold cases living on in filing cabinets and databases, in the hearts of people who refuse to forget. The investigation into the Colonial Parkway murders continued through 1988 through 1989 into the 1990s. The task force gradually shrank as resources were redirected to other pressing cases. But it never entirely disbanded. Someone was always working the case, always reviewing evidence, always hoping for a break. In the early 1990s, DNA analysis became more sophisticated and more widely available to law enforcement. The Colonial Parkway evidence was reviewed to see what could be tested with this new technology. Some biological material had been preserved from the crime scenes. It was tested and DNA profiles were developed. But without a suspect to compare them against, the profiles just went into databases, waiting. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, became operational in the late 1990s. DNA evidence from the Colonial Parkway cases was entered into the system, compared against samples from convicted offenders across the country. No matches. The killer, if his DNA was in the system, wasn't in there for these crimes. As the decades passed, the investigation employed increasingly sophisticated techniques. Geographic profiling software was used to analyze the locations of the crimes, attempting to identify where the killer might live or work based on the pattern of attacks. The analysis suggested someone familiar with the area, probably living within a 30-mile radius of the parkway. But that described thousands of people. Forensic genealogy, the technique that would eventually solve numerous cold cases in the 2010s and 2020s, was applied to the Colonial Parkway evidence. DNA profiles were compared against genetic genealogy databases, attempting to identify potential suspects through family connections. This work is ongoing, complicated by the age of the evidence and the limitations of the samples. Behavioral analysis was revisited multiple times as understanding of serial killers evolved. New profilers, new perspectives, new theories. Some suggested the killer might have been in the military, given the proximity to numerous military bases in the area and the organized nature of the crimes. Others suggested law enforcement or security background, someone who understood how police investigations worked and how to avoid leaving evidence. One theory that gained traction was the possibility that the killer had died or been incarcerated for other crimes shortly after the 1988 attacks. This would explain why the murders stopped. Investigators looked at deaths and incarcerations in the region in 1988 and 1989, trying to identify anyone who matched the profile and whose timeline aligned with the cessation of the crimes. Several individuals were identified as persons of interest through this process. Men who died in car accidents, suicides, or from illness in the late 1980s. men who were incarcerated for other violent crimes around the same time. But connecting any of them definitively to the Colonial Parkway murders proved impossible. Dead men can't give statements, and without physical evidence linking them to the crimes, suspicion remained just that, suspicion. In the 2000s, the case received renewed attention when a former FBI profiler published a book about unsolved serial killer cases and included a chapter on the Colonial Parkway murders. The book brought new eyes to the evidence, new theories to the discussion. It also brought new tips, though none panned out. The families never stopped pushing for answers. Kathy Thomas's parents, before they passed away, established a memorial scholarship in her name at the Naval Academy. Becky Dowski's family created a foundation supporting LGBTQ youth, honoring Becky's memory by helping others who faced discrimination. David Nobling's father, until his death, maintained a website about the case, posting updates, sharing theories, refusing to let his son be forgotten. Robin Edwards' family largely stayed out of the public eye, their grief too raw, too private. But they attended every press conference when there were developments. They were there, silent witnesses to the investigation's progress and setbacks. Keith Call and Cassandra Haley's families faced the unique torture of not knowing. No bodies meant no closure, no burial, no final goodbye, just eternal waiting for answers that might never come. Sandra's mother refused to move from their house in Virginia Beach because Sandra might come home. She maintained Sandra's bedroom exactly as it had been in 1988. A shrine to a daughter who had been 18 years old for decades, frozen in time. The investigators who worked the case, many now retired, carried it with them. In interviews years later, they spoke about the Colonial Parkway murders as the case that got away, the one they couldn't solve despite their best efforts. Some admitted it haunted them, that they still occasionally pulled out their old notes and reviewed them, hoping to see something they'd missed. Some confessed they couldn't drive the Colonial Parkway anymore. The memory's too painful. In 2010, the FBI released some crime scene photos from the first murders, Kathy Thomas and Becky Dowski, hoping that fresh eyes might notice something significant. The photos were redacted to protect the dignity of the victims, but they still showed the positioning, the staging, the attempted arson. The release generated tips, but again, nothing that moved the case forward. The release also generated controversy. Some families felt the photos should never have been made public, that it violated their loved ones' privacy and dignity. The FBI defended the decision, stating that solving the case took precedence, that the families had been consulted, though not all agreed with the choice. In 2017, nearly 30 years after the last attack, the FBI announced they were offering a reward of up to $25,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person or persons responsible for the Colonial Parkway murders. The announcement came with a renewed appeal to the public, particularly to anyone who might have information they'd been afraid to share, who might have been protecting someone, who might now be willing to come forward. The announcement generated media coverage, brought the case back into public consciousness for a moment. Tips came in, investigators followed up, and once again nothing definitive emerged. The current status of the investigation is active but cold. Investigators still review the evidence periodically. New technologies are as they become available. The case files remain open, but there's a realistic understanding that without new information, a confession, a credible witness, a DNA match, the case may never be solved. Theories about the Colonial Parkway murders have proliferated over the decades. Some are well-reasoned, based on evidence and professional analysis. Others are wild speculation, conspiracy theories that say more about the theorists than about the actual crimes. One persistent theory involves a former law enforcement officer or someone with security training. The reasoning is that the killer showed sophisticated knowledge of crime scene management, of how to avoid leaving evidence, of when and where to strike to minimize risk. Some have pointed to specific individuals, though without evidence these accusations are just rumors. Another theory suggests the killer was connected to the military, possibly someone stationed at one of the many bases in the region, who was then transferred elsewhere, explaining why the attack stopped. The military connection is appealing because it would explain the organized nature of the crimes and provide a reason for the sudden cessation. A third theory, more controversial, suggests that at least some of the Colonial Parkway cases are unrelated. That Kathy and Becky's murders might have committed by one person, while David and Robin's were committed by someone else. That Keith and Sandra's disappearance might be unconnected to either. This theory is generally rejected by investigators who see too many similarities to believe the cases aren't linked. But it persists in some circles. There are darker theories. Some involve satanic cults or ritualistic killing, pointing to the staging of bodies as evidence of occult practices. These theories gained traction in the late 1980s and early 1990s when satanic panic was at its height, but they're generally dismissed by serious investigators as having no evidentiary basis. Some theories involve multiple killers working together, a killing team. This would explain some of the variation in methods. Different members of the team took the lead on different attacks. It would also explain how the killer controlled multiple victims simultaneously, a challenging task for a single individual. But there's no evidence of multiple perpetrators, and statistically, serial killers almost always work alone. One of the most disturbing theories suggests the killer may have claimed more victims, whose cases haven't been connected to the Colonial Parkway murders. The thinking is that if he killed at least 8 people over a roughly 2-year period, he might have killed before and after in other locations. Investigators have looked at unsolved murders in Virginia and neighboring states, searching for similar patterns. Some cases show superficial similarities, but none have been definitively linked. The question of why the killing stopped remains central to all theorizing. Serial killers don't typically stop voluntarily. They escalate, not de-escalate. They kill till they're caught, killed, incapacitated, or circumstances make it impossible to continue. So what happened? The most likely explanations are death, incarceration, or relocation. If the killer died in the late 1980s or early 1990s, the crimes would naturally cease. If he was arrested and imprisoned for other crimes, same result. If he moved away from the area, perhaps due to military transfer or job change, he might have stopped killing on the Colonial Parkway specifically, though he might have continued elsewhere. There's also the possibility, however remote, that he did stop voluntarily, that something in his life changed, marriage, religious conversion, fear of getting caught, and he managed to suppress his compulsions. This is extremely rare but not unheard of. Some serial killers have had periods of dormancy lasting years or even decades. The Colonial Parkway itself has changed over the decades. Security was improved. Lighting was added at some locations. Patrol frequency increased. Warning signs were posted. These changes might have made it less attractive to a predator, though they came too late for the victims. The Parkway is still beautiful, still historic, still draws visitors who want to connect with America's colonial past. But for those who know its dark history, who remember the murders or lost someone to them, the Colonial Parkway will always be haunted. The ghosts of Kathy Thomas, Becky Dowski, David Nobling, Robin Edwards, Keith Call, and Cassandra Haley walk that road still, in the minds of those who loved them and those who tried to find their killer. In recent years, podcast creators and documentary filmmakers have revisited the Colonial Parkway murders. Each new treatment brings renewed attention, new theories, sometimes new tips. The families have mixed feelings about this attention. On one hand, they want the case solved and media coverage keeps it in the public eye. On the other hand, each retelling reopens wounds that never fully heal. Some family members have participated in these media projects, believing it might finally bring the breakthrough they've prayed for. Others have refused, unable to relive the trauma repeatedly. There's no right way to grieve. There's no right way to cope with losing someone to an unsolved murder. The investigators, both active and retired, have also participated in some of these projects. Their motivations are similar to the families: keep the case alive, keep people talking about it, hope that someone somewhere knows something and will finally come forward. But as the decades pass, hope dims, witnesses age and die, memories fade, evidence degrades. The likelihood of solving a 40-year-old case decreases with each passing year, no matter how sophisticated the technology becomes. Yet the investigators persist, because that's what you do when you've made a promise to the dead. You don't give up. You keep working, keep hoping, keep pushing, even when it seems hopeless. The Colonial Parkway murders represent one of Virginia's most infamous unsolved cases. They changed how law enforcement approached serial killer investigations in the region. They changed how the public viewed personal safety. They changed the families forever. 8 people, 4 separate incidents, 1 haunted roadway, and somewhere, maybe still alive, maybe long dead, is the person who knows what happened, the person who was there, the person who killed or helped kill or watched someone else kill and said nothing. That person holds the answers that 8 families have been desperate for since the 1980s. The answers that investigators have pursued through thousands of hours of work. The answers that might bring justice, or at least closure, or at the very least truth. But those answers remain hidden, locked away in the mind of a monster who may never speak, or buried with secrets that may never surface. The Colonial Parkway keeps its secrets well. Fourth chunk, the Colonial Parkway murders, the passage of time to strange things to unsolved cases. They take on mythic qualities, growing larger in memory than they were in reality. Details become distorted through retelling. Facts blur with speculation. The crimes themselves remain fixed in the past, but the stories about them evolve, mutate, take on lives of their own. For the Colonial Parkway murders, this transformation happened gradually through the 1990s and accelerated in the internet age. Online forums dedicated to true crime began discussing the cases, amateur sleuths analyzing evidence they'd never seen firsthand, developing theories based on newspaper articles and television documentaries. Some of this armchair investigation was thoughtful and well-intentioned. Some of it was wild speculation bordering on fantasy. The families found themselves navigating this new landscape where their private tragedies were public entertainment. Discussion boards dissected their loved ones' lives, debated their relationships, questioned their choices. Some family members engaged with these online communities, hoping that crowdsourcing the investigation might yield results. Others found it invasive and hurtful, withdrew entirely from the public sphere. One development that brought renewed focus to the case was the arrest of other serial killers, whose patterns resemble Parkway murders. In the 1990s and 2000s, several predators who targeted couples in isolated areas were caught and convicted. Each arrest prompted investigators to look for connections to the Virginia cases. One particularly promising lead involved a man arrested in Maryland in 1996 for the murder of 2 couples in remote park areas. His method was strikingly similar. Approach couples in parked cars late at night, control them through threat or violence, kill them, and arrange the bodies. When he was arrested, Virginia investigators immediately requested interviews. The man agreed to talk. He was facing multiple life sentences regardless, had nothing to lose by cooperating. Investigators spoke extensively about the Colonial Parkway murders. They showed him crime scene photos, asked about specific details, tried to determine if he had knowledge only the killer would possess. He denied involvement, said he'd never been to Virginia during the relevant time period. His timeline checked out. He'd been living and working IO in the 1980s, with employment records and witnesses to verify. Unless he'd traveled to Virginia specifically to commit murders and then returned home, which seemed unlikely given the frequency of the attacks, he couldn't have been responsible. Still, investigators pursued every angle. They looked for any connection he might have had to the area. Had he visited family there? Had he taken vacations there? Had he driven through on his way somewhere else? They found nothing. His DNA was compared against evidence from the Colonial Parkway cases. No match. He was ruled out as a suspect. But the exercise demonstrated how desperately investigators wanted to solve these cases. Any possibility, no matter how remote, had to be explored. Another individual who drew significant attention was a man who died in 2002 and had been living in the Hampton Roads area during the 1980s. He had never been arrested or suspected of any crimes during his lifetime. But after his death, family members' belongings gone, disturbing materials. A collection of newspaper clippings about the Colonial Parkway murders, detailed notes about the cases, and personal writings that suggested an unhealthy fascination with the crimes. The family contacted police, believing their deceased relative might have been involved. Investigators were skeptical. People collect crime news for many reasons. Fascination with true crime doesn't equal participation in it, but they investigated thoroughly. The man's background was examined. His whereabouts during the relevant dates were reconstructed as best they could be from old records and witness statements. His writings were analyzed by forensic psychologists. The analysis was inconclusive. The writings showed fascination but not guilty knowledge. He wrote about theories of who the killer might be and why, but nothing suggested he was writing from personal experience. His timeline placed him in the general area during the murders, but so were hundreds of thousands of other people. Without physical evidence linking him to the crimes, suspicion was all investigators had. An attempt was made to recover DNA from personal items he'd owned, but the samples were too degraded to be useful. He'd been cremated, so direct DNA comparison was impossible. The investigation into him eventually stalled, leaving another frustrating maybe in a case full of them. The question of whether all the Colonial Parkway cases were connected continued to be debated within law enforcement circles. The official position remained that they were likely related, the work of one killer or possibly a killing team, but some investigators privately expressed doubts. The differences in methodology bothered them. The first case involved close contact violence with edged weapons and attempted arson. The second involved shooting from distance and no fire. The third and fourth involved disappearances with no bodies recovered. That progression didn't fit typical serial killer patterns, which tend toward consistency and escalation within a chosen method rather than complete changes in approach. There was also the issue of target selection. Kathy Thomas and Becky Dowski were an adult same-sex couple. David Knobling and Robin Edwards were a young heterosexual couple with a significant age gap. Keith Call and Sandra Haley were college-age heterosexual couple. If the killer was driven by specific hatred or attraction toward a certain type of victim, the variety didn't make sense. Some investigators theorized that the killer wasn't targeting specific types of people but rather specific situations. He was hunting couples in parked cars, and the demographics didn't matter to him. The vulnerability mattered, the opportunity mattered, the isolation mattered. Who the victims were as individuals was irrelevant to him. This theory painted a picture of an utterly cold, predatory individual, not someone driven by sexual desire for a particular type or hatred for a particular group, but someone who simply enjoyed killing and chose victims based purely on accessibility. In some ways, this was more chilling than a killer with a specific type. It meant anyone could be a victim. There was no profile to avoid, no behavior that ensured safety. The geographic analysis of the crimes remained a focus of investigation. All the incidents clustered along a specific stretch of the Colonial Parkway and nearby areas. This suggested local knowledge, familiarity with the terrain, understanding of traffic patterns and patrol schedules. Investigators created detailed maps showing the crime scenes, the times of day, the day of the week, weather conditions, moon phases, anything that might reveal a pattern. Some patterns emerged. All attacks occurred during periods of low visibility, evening, night, or early morning. All occurred during times when traffic on the parkway would be light. All occurred at locations that offered both privacy and escape routes. But these patterns didn't narrow the suspect pool significantly. They described someone who was careful, who planned, who thought strategically. That could be almost anyone with intelligence and patience. One theory that gained some traction involved someone who gave them access to the parkway and knowledge of its patterns. Park rangers were looked at closely, though none emerged as serious suspects. Maintenance workers for the National Park Service were interviewed. Even the historians and guides at the nearby colonial sites were considered, though most were quickly eliminated. The idea of someone with official access was appealing because it would explain several things. How the killer could be present without raising suspicion. How he could know when and where to strike. How he might have inside knowledge of investigation progress. But like so many theories in this case, it couldn't be proven or disproven without a suspect. As the case entered the 2010s, now decades old, some investigative techniques that weren't available in the 1980s could finally be applied. Advanced DNA analysis could extract profiles from smaller, more degraded samples. Forensic genealogy could identify suspects through family DNA. Digital forensics could analyze metadata and electronic traces that older investigations never considered. The evidence was retested using these new methods. Some samples that had been too small or degraded for 1980s technology yielded usable DA profiles in the 2010. These profiles were entered into databases, compared against millions of samples, and still no matches to known offenders. The forensic genealogy approach was more complex. It required not just DNA but genealogical research, building family trees, identifying potential suspects through genetic relatives. This work was painstaking, time-consuming, and expensive. It had solved other cold cases spectacularly, the Golden State Killer case being the most famous example. But it required good DA samples and a bit of luck. For the Colonial Parkway cases, the work continues. Genetic profiles have been developed and are being compared against genealogy databases. Family trees are being constructed for genetic relatives who show up as matches. Potential suspects identified through this process are being investigated. But as of now, no arrests have been made based on this approach. Part of the challenge is the age of the evidence. DNA degrades over time, especially if it hasn't been stored under ideal conditions. The 1980s crime scene evidence spent years in storage facilities that may not have had optimal temperature and humidity controls. Some samples that might have been useful decades ago are now too degraded to work with. Another challenge is the possibility of contamination. In the 1980s, crime scene protocols weren't as stringent as they are now. Investigators didn't always wear gloves and protective equipment. Evidence could be contaminated by the people collecting it. DNA from investigators, medical examiners, or lab technicians could be mixed with DNA from the crime scenes. Modern analysis can sometimes distinguish between different contributors, but it's not always possible. The question of media involvement in the case has been complicated. On one hand, media coverage keeps the cases in the public consciousness, potentially generating tips that could solve them. On the other hand, media coverage can interfere with investigations, cause pain to families, and generate false leads that waste investigative resources. In 2018, a true crime podcast dedicated multiple episodes to the Colonial Parkway murders. The podcast was well-researched, interviewed family members and investigators, and presented the cases thoughtfully. It generated significant attention and thousands of new tips to the FBI. Investigators had to process all those tips, separate the credible from the incredible, follow up on anything promising. The vast majority led nowhere, people misremembering things, people confusing these cases with others, people offering vague suspicions without evidence. But a few tips were deemed worthy of serious investigation. One tip led investigators to a man who had worked near the Colonial Parkway in the 1980s and had a history of violence against women. He'd served time for assault and had been suspected in other attacks. When investigators looked into him, they found he'd died in 2015. They obtained DNA from relatives for comparison. The comparison was inconclusive. Not a definitive match, but not a definitive exclusion either. Without more samples or the ability to question the suspect himself, the lead went cold. Another tip came from someone who claimed their father had confessed to the murders on his deathbed. The tipster provided specific details that hadn't been made public, which got investigators' attention. But when they dug deeper, they found the tipster had a history of providing false information to police in other cases, apparently seeking attention or reward money. The details they'd provided had actually been shared in a closed online group years earlier, which the tipster had access to. The tip was deemed not credible. This illustrates the challenge of cold case tips. After decades separating truth from fiction, reliable witnesses from attention seekers, becomes increasingly difficult. Memory fades and distorts. People conflate different events. People lie for various reasons. Every tip has to be taken seriously enough to evaluate, but precious investigative resources can't be wasted chasing ghosts. The family's relationship with the investigation has evolved over the decades. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, they were in constant contact with investigators, calling daily, offering suggestions, desperately seeking updates. As years passed, the contact became less frequent. Updates came quarterly, then annually, then only when there were significant developments. Some family members have expressed frustration with the pace of the investigation. They feel it should have been solved by now, that someone knows something and isn't telling, that law enforcement could be doing more. These feelings are understandable but often not entirely fair. The investigators have worked tirelessly within the constraints of available evidence and technology. Other family members have come to a kind of peace with the uncertainty. Not acceptance exactly. You never accept the murder of a loved one, but an acknowledgement that some questions may never be answered in this life. They've found ways to honor their loved ones' memories without letting the search for justice consume them entirely. The difference in these approaches often correlates with personality and coping mechanisms. Some people need to fight, need to keep pushing, need to maintain hope of eventual resolution. Others need to grieve and move forward as best they can. Neither approach is wrong. Grief is individual. For the investigators, especially those who worked the case when it was fresh, retirement brought complicated feelings. They left the job without solving the case that defined their careers. Some stayed in touch with the investigation, offering consulting and advice. Others made clean breaks, unable to continue carrying the weight. One retired detective who had been central to the original investigation gave an interview in 2020. He was asked if he thought the case would ever be solved. His answer was honest and heartbreaking. "I hope so. I pray so. But I don't know. We gave it everything we had back then. The new guys are giving it everything they have now. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it's not. These cases, they eat at you. You dream about them. You wake up at 3 in the morning thinking maybe you missed something. But we didn't miss anything. We just didn't have enough. The killer was careful or lucky or both. And 8 people paid for that with their lives. The physical locations of the crimes have changed over the decades, but are still recognizable. The Colonial Parkway underwent renovations and improvements in the 1990s and 2000s. Some of the specific turnouts where bodies were found have been modified, but the basic character of the road remains: beautiful, historic, isolated in places. People still use the overlooks. On any given day, you'll find tourists there, taking photos, reading historical markers, enjoying the views. Most have no idea they're standing near where someone died. The parkway doesn't advertise its dark history. The Park Service doesn't want the area defined by the murders, but locals know. Drive the parkway with someone from the area, and they'll point out the spots. That's where they found the first couple. The second couple was down by the river there. Those two, they never found them, but their car was right over there. The history is passed down generation to generation, a cautionary tale about danger lurking in beautiful places. Some people avoid the parkway entirely, especially at night. Others are drawn to it, morbid curiosity compelling them to see where it happened. There have been reports of dark tourists, visiting the crime scenes, taking photos, sometimes leaving flowers or notes. The families have mixed feelings about this. Some appreciate that people remember. Others feel it's exploitative. The parkway has acquired a reputation for being haunted. Ghost stories circulate about singers on the roadside, about cars that appear and disappear, about hearing screams when no one is there. These stories almost certainly have more to do with suggestion and imagination than any genuine paranormal activity. But they speak to how thoroughly the murders have scared the collective psyche of the region. The impact on the local community extended beyond fear and changed behavior. The murders became a shared trauma, a dark thread woven into the area's identity. For people who lived through that period, the Colonial Parkway murders are a defining memory, a before and after marker in their lives. Schools held assemblies about safety. Parents gave their teenagers strict rules about where they could go and when they had to be home. Couples stopped going to isolated spots. The social fabric of the community changed, became more cautious, more suspicious, trusting. Some of these changes were permanent. Even now, decades later, parents in the area warn their children about the dangers of isolated places. The parkway itself, while used, is not the popular romantic spot it once was. The murders created a cultural shift that outlasted the immediate danger. The question of why the Colonial Parkway specifically became this killer's hunting ground remains unanswered but heavily theorized. The parkway offered several advantages to a predator. It was geographically accessible, connecting major population centers. It had numerous isolated spots where privacy could be expected. It was under federal jurisdiction, which could complicate investigations involving multiple local law enforcement agencies. And it was a place where couples naturally went for privacy. But there might have been more to it than simple tactical advantage. The parkway represents American history, American ideals. Was the killer making a statement by defiling this symbolic space? Was there something in his psychology that drew him specifically to this historic corridor? Some profilers have suggested the killer might have had a personal connection to the area, perhaps a negative experience associated with the parkway or the colonial sites. Maybe he was rejected by a girlfriend there. Maybe he had family trauma connected to the location. Maybe he felt powerless in his regular life, and the parkway became a place where he could exert ultimate power. These are psychological theories without evidence, but they attempt to answer the why that pure tactical analysis can't. Because while we can understand how someone might choose such a location for practical reasons, understanding why someone would want to kill couples in the first place requires delving into the darkest recesses of human psychology. The victimology has been analyzed exhaustively. 8 people from different backgrounds, different ages, different life circumstances. What they had in common was being young, being paired with someone, and being vulnerable. They were at transitional moments in their lives. College students, young professionals, someone starting a career, someone planning a future. Psychologists have noted that serial killers often choose victims who represent something to them. Sometimes victims are surrogates for someone the killer wants to hurt but can't. Sometimes victims represent an ideal the killer is attracted to and wants to possess and destroy. Sometimes victims are simply convenient targets whose individual identities don't matter. For the Colonial Parkway killer, the latter seems most likely. The variety in victim characteristics suggests he wasn't fixated on a specific type of person. He was fixated on a specific situation. Couples in isolated locations. The people themselves were almost incidental to his fantasy. They were objects, pieces in his ritual, not individuals with personalities and dreams and worth. This objectification is common among serial killers but still chilling to contemplate. Kathy Thomas had just transitioned to civilian life and was building a new career. Becky Dowski was months from college graduation. David Nobling was saving money and planning his future. Robin Edwards was only 14, barely started on her life. Keith Call was an athlete with discipline and drive. Sandra Haley wanted to be a teacher to help children learn and grow. All of that, all the specificity, the individuality, the potential, meant nothing to the person who killed them. They were reduced to bodies, to objects to be used in whatever dark fantasy drove the killer. Understanding this level of dehumanization is difficult for most people, which is why these cases fascinate and horrify in equal measure. The forensic psychology of the Colonial Parkway killer has been debated extensively. What kind of person commits these crimes? What drives someone to hunt couples, to inflict terror, to take lives with apparent calculation, and then simply vanish into normalcy? The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit has revised their profile multiple times over the decades as understanding of serial offenders has evolved. The current profile suggests a white male, likely between 25 and 40 years old at the time of the murders, which would make him 60 to 75 now if still alive. He would have been organized, intelligent, capable of maintaining a normal facade while harboring violent fantasies. He likely had a job, possibly a family, certainly relationships that appeared normal to outsiders. This type of offender is particularly dangerous because they blend in. They're not the obvious monsters of popular imagination. They're neighbors, coworkers, family members. They compartmentalize their violence, keeping it separate from their everyday lives. Ted Bundy worked at a suicide hotline and was considered charming and trustworthy. Dennis Rader was a church council president and Boy Scout leader. Monsters wear human faces. The profile suggests someone with local knowledge of the area. Someone who understood the rhythms of the parkway, when patrols occurred, when traffic was lightest. This points to a resident rather than a transient. Someone who had spent significant time in the region and knew it intimately. The staging of bodies suggests a compulsive element. a need for control and arrangement that went beyond simply killing. This indicates someone acting out specific fantasies, someone for whom the murder itself wasn't enough. The presentation mattered. This ritualistic aspect is common among certain types of serial killers, those for whom the crime is about creating a scene that matches an internal vision. The ability to stop killing, if indeed the killer did stop voluntarily, would be extremely unusual. Most serial killers cannot stop through willpower alone. They kill until external circumstances prevent them: death, imprisonment, physical incapacity. If the Colonial Parkway killer stopped by choice, it would suggest an extraordinary level of self-control, someone who recognized the increasing risk and made a rational decision to cease. More likely explanations for the cessation include death, imprisonment for other crimes, or relocation far from the area. Investigators have pursued all these possibilities, looking at deaths and incarcerations in the late 1980s and early 1990s, examining whether anyone fitting the profile moved away during that period. Some candidates have emerged, but none with sufficient evidence to confirm suspicion. The question of multiple perpetrators has never been definitively settled. Some investigators believe the differences in methodology point to different killers, that at least some of the cases attributed to the Colonial Parkway killer are actually unrelated. Others maintain that all the cases share too many similarities to be coincidental, that the differences represent evolution or adaptation rather than different offenders. If multiple killers were involved, it would explain some puzzling aspects of the cases. Different weapons, different levels of staging, different outcomes for the victims. But it would also mean an extraordinary and unlikely coincidence: multiple predators independently choosing the same hunting ground during the same narrow time period. While possible, this seems less probable than a single killer modifying his approach. The families live with uncertainty stacked upon tragedy. Not only did they lose loved ones to violence, they lost them without resolution. The not knowing compounds the grief. Was justice ever served? Even unknowingly. Did the killer die in a car accident, taking his secrets with him? Did he go to prison for something else, paying for crimes even if not these specific ones? Or is he still out there, an old man now, carrying memories of what he did? These questions haunt the families during quiet moments, during anniversaries, during the holidays when absence feels most acute. They see men of the right age and wonder, could that be him? They read about other solved cold cases and feel both hope and envy. They attend vigils and memorial services and try to find meaning in senseless loss. The investigators, both active and retired, carry their own burdens. They gave years of their lives to these cases, sacrificed time with their own families, absorbed trauma through exposure to horrific crime scenes and grieving relatives. They did everything right according to the standards of their time, and still the cases remain unsolved. Modern investigators continue the work with better tools but the same dedication. DNA analysis improves constantly. Forensic genealogy opens new avenues. Digital forensics can extract information from evidence in ways unimaginable in the 1980s. Each technological advance renewed hope that this might be the breakthrough. This might be what finally cracks the case. The community has learned to live with its dark history. The Colonial Parkway murders are part of the region's story now, alongside the founding of Jamestown and the siege of Yorktown. They represent a different kind of history, one of vulnerability and loss rather than triumph and founding. But they're remembered nonetheless. Memorial markers have been placed at some locations, not official monuments but personal tributes left by those who knew the victims or simply care about their stories. Flowers appear periodically, faded and replaced by fresh ones. Notes are left, expressing sorrow, promising remembrance. These small acts of remembrance keep the victim's humanity visible in places that were dehumanization. The parkway itself endures, beautiful and haunted, historic and horrifying. Tourists still drive it, most unaware of what happened there. The trees still arch overhead. The river still flows alongside. The overlooks still offer stunning views. History layers upon history, the colonial past intersecting with more recent tragedy, all of it part of the complicated story of American life. And somewhere in the evidence files, the crime scene photos, the DNA samples, the witness statements, the thousands of pages of investigation notes, might be the detail that solves everything. The clue that's been overlooked for decades. The connection no one has made yet. The answer that's been there all along waiting to be seen. Or maybe not. Maybe some mysteries remain mysteries. Some questions go unanswered, some monsters escape justice in this world. The Colonial Parkway murders may be one of those cases where, despite best efforts and latest technology and deepest dedication, the truth stays hidden. As we approach the present day, the Colonial Parkway murders occupy a strange space in American crime history. They're well known among true crime enthusiasts, but not quite household names like the Zodiac Killer or Jack the Ripper. They're actively investigated but realistically cold. They're solvable in theory but stubbornly resistant in practice. The advances in investigative technology over the past decade have been remarkable. What seemed impossible in the 1980s is routine now. DNA can be extracted from the tiniest samples, a few cells left on fabric, trace amounts in saliva on an envelope, touch DNA from skin contact with an object. The sensitivity of testing has increased exponentially. Forensic genealogy has revolutionized cold case investigation. By comparing DNA from crime scenes to genetic profiles in genealogy databases, investigators can identify potential suspects through family connections. Someone uploads their DNA to a genealogy website, hoping to learn about their ancestry, and unknowingly provides the link that solves a decades-old murder. This technique was used to identify the Golden State Killer in 2018, solving a case that had baffled investigators for 40 years. The success of that case energized cold case units across the country, including those working the Colonial Parkway murders. If Joseph D'Angelo could be caught through genealogy after evading capture for decades, maybe the Colonial Parkway Killer could be too. The DNA evidence from the Colonial Parkway cases has been submitted for genealogy analysis. Genetic profiles have been developed and uploaded to databases. Family trees are being constructed for genetic relatives who appear as matches. This work is ongoing, painstaking, requiring collaboration between forensic geneticists, genealogists, and investigators. The process is not simple or quick. A DNA match to a third or fourth cousin doesn't immediately identify a suspect. It identifies a branch of a family tree. Genealogists then have to research that branch, identify all the descendants, determine which ones match the age and gender profile of the suspected killer, and narrow down the list through other investigative means. For the Colonial Parkway cases, this process is complicated by the age of the evidence and the quality of the DNA samples. Not all the recovered DNA is necessarily from the killer. It could be from the victims, from investigators who handled evidence before protocols were strict, from innocent third parties who touched surfaces before the crimes occurred. Sorting signal from noise is challenging. Additionally, genealogy databases rely on people voluntarily uploading their DNA. If the killer's relatives haven't uploaded their genetic information to these databases, or if they've opted out of law enforcement matching, the technique won't work. It's a powerful tool, but not a guaranteed solution. Still, the work continues. As more people upload their DNA to genealogy websites, the databases grow, and the likelihood of finding a useful match increases. Investigators remain hopeful that a breakthrough could come at any time. A new upload, a new match, a new family tree connection that finally points to a name. Beyond DNA and genealogy, other modern techniques are being applied. Digital forensics can analyze metadata from old photographs, potentially identifying when and where they were taken. Geographic information systems can model the killer's likely home base using sophisticated algorithms. Social network analysis can map connections between people who lived in the area during the relevant time period, potentially identifying overlooked suspects. Some investigators have explored the possibility of using artificial intelligence to analyze the case files. Machine learning algorithms can identify patterns humans might miss, correlations buried in thousands of pages of reports and tips. This technology is still emerging in law enforcement applications, but it holds promise for cold cases where traditional methods have been exhausted. The FBI continues to maintain an active investigation. Tips are still accepted and evaluated. New leads are still followed. The case files are reviewed periodically, ensuring nothing has been missed, looking at old evidence with new eyes. The Bureau's commitment to solving these cases has never wavered. even as the likelihood of traditional investigative breakthroughs has diminished. In 2021, the FBI released a new public appeal for information, timed to coincide with the 35th anniversary of the first murders. The appeal included previously unreleased details about the crimes, hoping that specific information might trigger someone's memory or conscience. The appeal was distributed through traditional media and social media platforms, reaching a wider audience than would have been possible in earlier decades. The response was significant. Hundreds of tips came in, from people who remembered something from the 1980s, from people who had suspicions about relatives or acquaintances, from people offering theories or observations. Each tip was logged, evaluated, and followed up as appropriate. Most led nowhere. But the process continued because any one of those tips could be the one that matters. One tip that received serious attention came from someone who claimed to have witnessed suspicious behavior near one of the crime scenes around the time of the murders. The witness, now elderly, said they had been afraid to come forward at the time, because the person they saw was someone in a position of authority. Decades later, with that person deceased, the witness felt safe enough to speak. Investigators interviewed the witness extensively, trying to assess credibility and gather details. The witness described seeing a vehicle in one of the parkway overlooks late at night, around the time frame of one of the murders. They described the person in the vehicle in general terms: white male, middle-aged, driving a sedan. When shown photographs from the era, the witness tentatively identified someone. The identified individual had died in 2003. He had lived in the area during the 1980s and had a job that required him to travel the parkway regularly. Investigators obtained DNA from surviving relatives for comparison. The analysis is ongoing, complicated by the quality of both the crime scene DNA and the reference samples. Results are expected but not yet available. This exemplifies the current state of the investigation, following leads that emerged decades after the fact. Working with witnesses whose memories may be unreliable, trying to investigate people who are no longer alive to question. It's challenging work with no guarantees, but it's the work that must be done. The families continue to age, some passing away without ever knowing who killed their loved ones. Kathy Thomas's parents both died in the 2000s, their final years shadowed by unanswered questions. Becky Dowski's mother passed in 2019, having attended every press conference, every anniversary vigil, every public appeal for information over 3 decades. Her final words on the subject, given in an interview shortly before her death, were simple and heartbreaking. "I just want to know why. I want to know who took my baby from me. I want to understand. But I'm running out of time." David Nobling's father remained a fierce advocate until his death in 2015. He had maintained a website about the case, posted regular updates, reached out to anyone who might help. His dedication was extraordinary, born of love and sustained by hope that someday, somehow, there would be justice for his son. Rob and Edward's parents have stayed largely private, their grief too personal for public consumption. They have declined most media requests over the years, choosing to remember their daughter privately rather than publicly. Their pain is no less real for being less visible. Keith Call's family has been torn between hope and despair. The absence of bodies means they cannot definitively bury their loved one. Cannot have that closure. Keith's mother has said in interviews that part of her still hopes Keith might somehow, impossibly, still be alive. She knows it's not rational, knows it's been too long. But hope is not always rational. Sandra Haley's family has similarly struggled with the lack of closure. Sandra's bedroom remained unchanged for years after her disappearance. A shrine to a daughter frozen in time at 18 years old. Eventually, her parents moved from their Virginia Beach home, unable to living with that permanent reminder. But Sandra's memory moved with them, carried in their hearts in photographs, in the Yonzo absence at family gatherings. The siblings of the victims carry their own grief and their own drive for justice. Some have become advocates, speaking publicly about the cases, pushing for continued investigation. Others have stepped back, building their own lives while carrying the loss privately. There's no right way to be the surviving sibling of a murder victim. The friends of the victims, now in their 50s and 60s, remember their lost classmates and companions. They gather occasionally, sharing memories, keeping the past alive. For them, these aren't just famous unsolved murders, they're personal losses, people they knew and loved who were stolen away. The community's relationship with the murders has evolved over the decades. For people who lived through that terrifying period in the late 1980s, the cases remain viscerally real. For younger generations who grew up hearing the stories, their local legend, cautionary tales, history. The Parkway is just a road to them, beautiful and historic. The murders a distant darkness that doesn't touch their daily lives. But the murders did change the culture of the region permanently. Safety awareness is higher. Trust is lower. Parents warn children about the dangers of isolated places. The innocence that existed before 1986, when the Colonial Parkway was just a scenic drive, cannot be recovered. The knowledge of what happened there colors everything. The parkway itself shows the passage of time. Some of the overlooks have been renovated, parking areas repaved, vegetation trimmed back. Historical markers have been updated with modern information displays. But the basic character remains: a beautiful road, a beautiful country, connecting sites of enormous historical importance. On any given day, you can drive the Colonial Parkway and see tourists taking photographs, families having picnics, couples enjoying the views. Life continues. The parkway serves its intended purpose of connecting people to American history. The murders are part of that history now, but they don't define it entirely. For investigators, both past and present, the Colonial Parkway murders represent unfinished business. Every detective has cases that haunt them, cases they couldn't solve despite their best efforts. For those who work these cases, the weight is particularly heavy because of the number of victims, the brutality of the crimes, and the years of work that haven't yielded justice. Some retired investigators have written about their experiences, processing their feelings through the act of documentation. They describe the frustration of having a strong sense of who the killer might be but lacking evidence to prove it. They describe the guilt of not solving the cases, even though they understand intellectually that they did everything possible with the tools and information available. Current investigators approach the cases with fresh eyes but deep respect for the work that came before. They understand they're standing on the shoulders of those earlier investigators, building on decades of work. They have advantages their predecessors didn't: better technology, more sophisticated databases, new techniques. But they also face challenges. Witnesses have died. Evidence has degraded, memories have faded. The question of whether the Colonial Parkway murders will ever be solved remains open. Optimists point to the steady march of technology, to cases that have been solved after 50 or 60 years, to the power of forensic genealogy and DNA analysis. They believe it's only a matter of time before the right piece of evidence is tested with the right technology and produces a breakthrough. Pessimists note that some cases simply don't have enough evidence to solve, regardless of technology. If the killer was careful enough, if he left minimal trace evidence, if the crime scene evidence has degraded too much over the decades, there may not be enough to work with. And if the killer is dead and his relatives haven't uploaded their DNA to genealogy databases, even modern techniques might not help. Realists acknowledge both possibilities. The cases might be solved. They might not. The only certainty is that investigators will continue trying, using every available tool, following every credible lead, refusing to give up on 8 people who deserve justice. The Colonial Parkway murders have become more than individual crimes. They've become symbols of vulnerability, of evil hiding in plain sight, of the limitations of law enforcement, of families enduring love and pain. They've inspired books, documentaries, podcasts, academic papers. They've entered the cultural consciousness, part of America's dark tapestry of unsolved crimes. But beneath the symbolism, beneath the media attention and the theories and the speculation, are 8 real people whose lives were cut short. Kathy Thomas, who served her country and was building a new career. Becky Dowski, who was months from graduating college. David Nobling, who was saving money and planning his future. Robin Edwards, who was only 14 years old. Keith Call, who was a dedicated athlete with dreams ahead of him. Sandra Haley, who wanted to be a teacher and help children learn. 6 names confirmed dead. 2 bodies never found but presumed dead based on the circumstances and the passage of time. 8 futures stolen, 8 families shattered, 1 killer or possibly more, who has escaped justice for nearly 4 decades. The story of the Colonial Parkway murders doesn't have an ending yet. It remains unfinished, unresolved, open. Somewhere in the files and the evidence, in the memories of people who haven't yet come forward, might be the answer. Or the answer might be lost forever, taken to the grave by someone who died without confessing, without being caught, without facing the consequences of what they did. We don't know how this story ends. We only know how it began, with 8 young people who made the simple decision to spend time on a beautiful, historic road, who couldn't have known they were driving toward their deaths, who trusted in the safety of a public space and were betrayed by the presence of evil. Their names deserve to be remembered. Their lives deserve to be honored. Their deaths deserve to be solved. The investigation continues. Technology advances, and the Colonial Parkway keeps its secrets for now. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this case, leave a comment and subscribe. Perhaps someone out there knows something. Perhaps someone is ready to speak. Perhaps justice delayed for decades might finally arrive. The families still wait. The investigators still work. The victims still deserve answers. Good night and stay safe.